cannot regard war with them as anything heroic. We cannot even imagine without horror the possibility of a disagreement between these people and ourselves which would call for reciprocal murder. Yet we are all bound to take a hand in this slaughter which is bound to come to pass tomorrow, if not today. It was very well for the Jew, the Greek, and the Roman to defend the independence of his nation by murder. For he piously believed that his people was the only true, fine, and good people dear to God, and all the rest were Philistines, barbarians. Men of medieval times, even up to the end of the last and beginning of this century, might continue to hold this belief. But however much we work upon ourselves, we cannot believe it. And this contradiction for men of the present day has become so full of horror that without its solution life is no longer possible. We live in a time which is full of inconsistencies, writes Count Komarovsky, the professor of international law, in his learned treatise. The press of all countries is continually expressing the universal desire for peace, and the general sense of its necessity for all nations. Representatives of governments, private persons, and official organs say the same thing. It is repeated in parliamentary debates, diplomatic correspondence, and even in state treaties. At the same time, governments are increasing the strength of their armies every year, levying fresh taxes, raising loans, and leaving as a bequest to future generations the duty of repairing the blunders of the senseless policy of the present. What a striking contrast between words and deeds! Of course governments will plead in justification of these measures that all their expenditure and armament are exclusively for purposes of defense. But it remains a mystery to every disinterested man whence they can expect attacks if all the great powers are single-hearted in their policy, in pursuing nothing but self-defense. In reality, it looks as if each of the great powers were every instant anticipating an attack on the part of the others, and this results in a general feeling of insecurity and superhuman efforts on the part of each government to increase their forces beyond those of the other powers. Such a competition of itself increases the danger of war. Nations cannot endure the constant increase of armies for long, and sooner or later they will prefer war to all the disadvantages of their present position and the constant menace of war. Then the most trifling pretext will be sufficient to throw the whole of Europe into the fire of universal war. And it is a mistaken idea that such a crisis might deliver us from the political and economical troubles that are crushing us. The experience of the wars of latter years teaches us that every war has only intensified national hatreds, made military burdens more crushing and insupportable, and rendered the political and economical grievous and insoluble. Modern Europe keeps under arms an active army of 9 millions of men, writes Enrico Ferri, besides 15 millions of reserve, with an outlay of 400 millions of francs per annum. By continual increase of the armed force, the sources of social and individual prosperity are paralyzed, and the state of the modern world may be compared to that of a man who condemns himself to wasting from lack of nutrition in order to provide himself with arms, losing thereby the strength to use the arms he provides, under the weight of which he will at last succumb. Charles Booth, in his paper read in London before the Association of the Reform and Codification of the Law of Nations, June 26, 1887, says the same thing. After referring to the same number, 9 millions of the active army and 15 millions of reserve, and the enormous expenditure of governments on the support and arming of these forces, he says, "These figures represent only a small part of the real cost, because besides the recognized expenditure of the war budget of the various nations, we ought also to take into account the enormous loss to society involved in withdrawing from it such an immense number of its most vigorous men, who are taken from industrial pursuits and every kind of labor, as well as the enormous interest on the sums expended on military preparations without any return. The inevitable result of this expenditure on war and preparations for war is a continually growing national debt. The greater number of loans raised by the governments of Europe were with a view to war. Their total sum amounts to 400 millions sterling, and these debts are increasing every year. The same Professor Komarovsky says in another place, "We live in troubled times. Everywhere we hear complaints of the depression of trade and manufactures, and the wretchedness of the economic position generally, the miserable conditions of existence of the working classes, and the universal impoverishment of the masses. But in spite of this, governments in their efforts to maintain their independence rush to the greatest extremes of senselessness. New taxes and duties are being devised everywhere, and the financial oppression of the nations knows no limits. If we glance at the budgets of the states of Europe for the last 100 years, what strikes us most of all is their rapid and continually growing increase. How can we explain this extraordinary phenomenon which sooner or later threatens us all with inevitable bankruptcy? It is caused beyond dispute by the expenditure for the maintenance of armaments, which swallows up a third and even a half of all the expenditure of European states. And the most melancholy thing is that one can foresee no limit to this augmentation of the budget and impoverishment of the masses. What is socialism but a protest against this abnormal position in which the greater proportion of the population of our world is placed? We are ruining ourselves, says Frederick Passy in a letter read before the last Congress of Universal Peace, in 1890, in London. We are ruining ourselves in order to be able to take part in the senseless wars of the future, or to pay the interest on debts we have incurred by the senseless and criminal wars of the past. We are dying of hunger so as to secure the means of killing each other. Speaking later on of the way the subject is looked at in France, he says, "We believe that, 100 years after the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, the time has come to recognize the rights of nations and to renounce at once and forever all those undertakings based on fraud and force, which, under the name of conquests, are veritable crimes against humanity, and which, whatever the vanity of monarchs and the pride of nations may think of them, only weaken even those who are triumphant over them." "I am surprised at the way religion is carried on in this country," said Sir Wilfrid Lawson at the same Congress. "You send a boy to Sunday school, and you tell him, 'Dear boy, you must love your enemies. If another boy strikes you, you mustn't hit him back, but try to reform him by loving him.' Well, the boy stays in the Sunday school till he is 14 or 15, and then his friends send him into the army. What has he to do in the army? He certainly won't love his enemy; quite the contrary, if he can only get at him, he will run him through with his bayonet. That is the nature of all religious teaching in this country. I do not think that it is a very good way of carrying out the precepts of religion. I think if it is a good thing for a boy to love his enemy, it is good for a grown-up man." "There are in Europe 28 millions of men under arms," says Wilson, "to decide disputes, not by discussion, but by murdering one another. That is the accepted method for deciding disputes among Christian nations. This method is, at the same time, very expensive, for, according to the statistics I have read, the nations of Europe spent in the year 1872 150 millions sterling on preparations for deciding disputes by means of murder. It seems to me, therefore, that in such a state of things one of two alternatives must be admitted. Either Christianity is a failure, or those who have undertaken to expound it have failed in doing so. Until our warriors are disarmed and our armies disbanded, we have not the right to call ourselves a Christian nation." In a conference on the subject of the duty of Christian ministers to preach against war, G.D. Bartlett said among other things, "If I understand the Scriptures, I say that men are only playing with Christianity so long as they ignore the question of war. I have lived a longish life, and have heard our ministers preach on universal peace hardly half a dozen times. 20 years ago, in a drawing room, I dared in the presence of 40 persons to moot the proposition that war was incompatible with Christianity. I was regarded as an arrant fanatic. The idea that we could get on without war was regarded as unmitigated weakness and folly. The Catholic priest de Fournay has expressed himself in the same spirit. One of the first precepts of the eternal law inscribed in the consciences of all men, says the Abbé de Fournay, is the prohibition of taking the life or shedding the blood of a fellow creature without sufficient cause, without being forced into the necessity of it. This is one of the commandments which is most deeply stamped in the heart of man. But so soon as it is a question of war, that is, of shedding blood in torrents, men of the present day do not trouble themselves about a sufficient cause. Those who take part in wars do not even think of asking themselves whether there is any justification for these innumerable murders, whether they are justifiable or unjustifiable, lawful or unlawful, innocent or criminal, whether they are breaking that fundamental commandment which forbids killing without lawful cause. But their conscience is mute. War has ceased to be something dependent on moral considerations. In warfare men have in all the toil and dangers they endure no other pleasure than that of being conquerors, no sorrow other than that of being conquered. Don't tell me that they are serving their country. A great genius answered that long ago in the words that have become a proverb. Without justice, what is an empire but a great band of brigands? And is not every band of brigands a little empire? They too have their laws, and they too make war to gain booty, and even for honor. The aim of the proposed institution, the institution of an international board of arbitration, is that the nations of Europe may cease to be nations of robbers, and their armies bands of brigands. And one must add, not only brigands, but slaves. For our armies are simply gangs of slaves at the disposal of one or two commanders or ministers who exercise a despotic control over them without any real responsibility, as we very well know. The peculiarity of a slave is that he is a mere tool in the hands of his master, a thing, not a man. That is just what soldiers, officers, and generals are, going to murder and be murdered at the will of a ruler or rulers. Military slavery is an actual fact, and it is the worst form of slavery, especially now when by means of compulsory service it lays its fetters on the necks of all the strong and capable men of a nation, to make them instruments of murder, butchers of human flesh, for that is all they are taken and trained to do. The rulers, 2 or 3 in number, meet together in cabinets, secretly deliberate without registers, without publicity, and consequently without responsibility, and send men to be murdered. Protests against armaments, burdensome to the people, have not originated in our times, says Señor E. G. Moneta. Hear what Montesquieu wrote in his day. France, and one might say Europe, will be ruined by soldiers. A new plague is spreading throughout Europe. It attacks sovereigns and forces them to maintain an incredible number of armed men. This plague is infectious and spreads, because directly one government increases its armament, all the others do likewise, so that nothing is gained by it but general ruin. Every government maintains as great an army as it possibly could maintain if its people were threatened with extermination, and people call peace this state of tension of all against all. And therefore, Europe is so ruined that if private persons were in the position of the governments of our continent, the richest of them would not have enough to live on. We are poor though we have the wealth and trade of the whole world. That was written almost 150 years ago. The picture seems drawn from the world of today. One thing only has changed, the form of government. In Montesquieu's time, it was said that the cause of the maintenance of great armaments was the despotic power of kings, who made war in the hope of augmenting by conquest their personal revenues and gaining glory. People used to say then, "Ah, if only people could elect those who would have the right to refuse governments the soldiers and the money. Then there would be an end to military politics." Now there are representative governments in almost the whole of Europe, and in spite of that, war expenditures and the preparations for war have increased to alarming proportions. It is evident that the insanity of sovereigns has gained possession of the ruling classes. War is not made now because one king has been wanting in civility to the mistress of another king, as it was in Louis XIV's time. But the natural and honorable sentiments of national honor and patriotism are so exaggerated, and the public opinion of one nation so excited against another, that it is enough for a statement to be made, even though it may be a false report, that the ambassador of one state was not received by the principal personage of another state, to cause the outbreak of the most awful and destructive war there has ever been seen. Europe keeps more soldiers under arms today than in the time of the great Napoleonic wars. All citizens with few exceptions are forced to spend some years in barracks. Fortresses, arsenals, and ships are built, new weapons are constantly being invented, to be replaced in a short time by fresh ones, for, sad to say, science, which ought always to be aiming at the good of humanity, assists in the work of destruction, and is constantly inventing new means for killing the greatest number of men in the shortest time. And to maintain so great a multitude of soldiers, and to make such vast preparations for murder, hundreds of millions are spent annually, sums which would be sufficient for the education of the people, and for immense works of public utility, and which would make it possible to find a peaceful solution of the social question. Europe, then, is, in this respect, in spite of all the conquests of science, in the same position as in the darkest and most barbarous days of the Middle Ages. All deplore this state of things, neither peace nor war, and all would be glad to escape from it. The heads of governments all declare that they wish for peace, and vie with one another in the most solemn protestations of peaceful intentions. But the same day or the next day they will lay a scheme for the increase of the armament before their legislative assembly, saying that these are the preventive measures they take for the very purpose of securing peace. But this is not the kind of peace we want, and the nations are not deceived by it. True peace is based on mutual confidence, while these huge armaments show open and utter lack of confidence, if not concealed hostility, between states. What should we say of a man who, wanting to show his friendly feelings for his neighbor, should invite him to discuss their differences with a loaded revolver in his hand? It is just this flagrant contradiction between the peaceful professions and the warlike policy of governments which all good citizens desire to put an end to, at any cost. People are astonished that every year there are 60,000 cases of suicide in Europe, and those only the recognized and recorded cases, and excluding Russia and Turkey. But one ought rather to be surprised that there are so few. Every man of the present day, if we go deep enough into the contradiction between his conscience and his life, is in a state of despair. Not to speak of all the other contradictions between modern life and the conscience, the permanently armed condition of Europe, together with its profession of Christianity, is alone enough to drive any man to despair, to doubt of the sanity of mankind, and to terminate an existence in this senseless and brutal world. This contradiction, which is a quintessence of all the other contradictions, is so terrible that to live and take part in it is only possible if one does not think of it, if one is able to forget it. What! All of us, Christians, not only profess to love one another, but do actually live one common life, we whose social existence beats with one common pulse, we aid one another, learn from one another, draw ever closer to one another to our mutual happiness, and spend in this closeness the whole meaning of life. And tomorrow some crazy ruler will say some stupidity, and another will answer in the same spirit, and then I must go expose myself to being murdered, and murder men who have done me no harm, and more than that, whom I love. And this is not a remote contingency, but the very thing we are all preparing for, which is not only probable, but an inevitable certainty. To recognize this clearly is enough to drive a man out of his senses, or to make him shoot himself. And this is just what does happen, and especially often among military men. A man need only come to himself for an instant to be impelled inevitably to such an end. And this is the only explanation of the dreadful intensity with which men of modern times strive to stupefy themselves with spirits, tobacco, opium, cards, reading newspapers, traveling, and all sorts of spectacles and amusements. These pursuits are followed up as an important, serious business. And indeed, they are a serious business. If there were no external means of dulling their sensibilities, half of mankind would shoot themselves without delay, for to live in opposition to one's reason is the most intolerable condition. And that is the condition of all men of the present day. All men of the modern world exist in a state of continual and flagrant antagonism between their conscience and their way of life. This antagonism is apparent in economic as well as political life. But most striking of all is the contradiction between the Christian law of the brotherhood of men existing in the conscience, and the necessity under which all men are placed by compulsory military service of being prepared for hatred and murder; of being at the same time a Christian and a gladiator. Chapter 6.